Okay, I think it's 5 past, so I'd suggest we make a start. Welcome everyone. Welcome to today's conversation on sustaining craft practice in the digital era. And this is part of Queen's Mary's Conversation Week. And we're very excited to have so many of you here today for what promises to be a really stimulating and interesting conversation about craft practice, community, and the digital. But firstly, on behalf of the panel, I would like to thank Queen Mary Network Centre for inviting us to have this conversation today, and also thank Queen Mary's Arts and Culture team for the organization of the series that this is part of. So my name is Katja May. I'm a researcher at Goldsmiths, working on crafts and feminist theory. And it is a really great pleasure for me today to be facilitating this conversation with our 4 excellent speakers. And the way we set this up is that we'll start with 3 minutes of provocations from each panelist. And then we'll have a conversation following those provocations. And then after that, we'll look at some case studies, mainly videos that the panelists have brought along and that we'll take a look at. And then we'll also have some time for Q&A. And I would ask you to please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. You can do so as we go along or towards the end, whatever you want to do. We'd also like to encourage you to use the chat function to talk with each other about any kind of things that you find interesting. Just pop it in there, as we really want to keep this in the spirit of a conversation. But please, of course, be mindful of like general etiquette in online spaces and just be respectful of what other people are saying. And since our conversation today is about craft, community, and the role of the digital, we've also thought about how we can bring these topics to life beyond the standard Zoom webinar format. And especially, during the current times when everything has kind of moved online, and this has had an effect of how we do craft individually and together. So we very much encourage you to please join us in a little creative experiment that hopefully will bring something of the materiality of craft into this online conversation, as well as allow us to make use of digital technologies to create at least a small sense of community amongst the participants in this conversation. All you need to participate is a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil, and we'd ask you to simply doodle on the paper as you're listening to the conversation, and just kind of use the doodling as a way to help you focus, but also to help you process the information and the kind of topics that are being discussed. And so in a way, kind of creatively respond and engage with the conversation. There's not a competition, and you don't need to be good at drawing or consider yourself an artist or anything. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. You're at the very end of it. Your doodle might look something like this. It might also be very colorful or look completely different. There's, anything goes. But we would love it if after the conversation, you'd share it to Instagram and Twitter as a way of kind of, creating community, creating a sense of togetherness in the digital realm beyond this actual event. And then if many of you do that, we might be able to kind of put this together as a digital collage. So I'll just share my screen and hang on a second, and I'll just give you the tags. Okay, just a second. So as you can see, there's the Instagram for Queen Mary Network Centre and the Twitter account. So you're please post it to social media and share your doodles, whatever they look like. It will be very interesting to see for everyone, I'm sure, what you've taken away, what inspired you, how you spend the next 90 minutes doodling. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Nick Bryan-Kinns, who is Professor of Interaction Design and Director of the Media and Arts Technology Centre for Doctoral Training at Queen Mary, University of London. And he's also a distinguished professor at Hunan University of Technology in China, as well as guest professor at Guangzhou University of Science and Technology. And Nick recently led an interdisciplinary team funded by the AHRC to examine the use of digital platforms for craft in the UK and China, exploring the role of digital technologies from social media to 3D printing and their impact on craft practice in the two countries. And I look very much forward to hearing more about this today. So I'll hand over to Nick.
Okay, thanks, Katja. So I'm Nick Bryan-Kinns. I'm Professor of Interaction Design. And as Katja said, I led this project looking at how digital platforms are used for craft and how they could be used to support craft or maybe not, what the challenges are as well. And this was a collaboration between Queen Mary and Hunan University in China, and also included the Queen Mary Network Center in the collaboration. So when I'm talking about digital technologies here, I'm talking about all sorts of things from online marketplaces through to social media and so on. That's a good slide. And here are some examples of the projects that we looked at. So we worked with about 14 detailed craft studies, but we also did a lot of workshops and surveys, interviews with people. In total, we must have worked with over 100 craft makers on this project. At the top, we see craft makers in China who are using both social media and laser cutting in their craft practice. And at the bottom, we see Tati Divine in London, who are jewelers who use laser cutting quite extensively in their practice and a lot of social media. So if we go to the next slide, let's look at this next example, which is Hand and Lock, who are an embroidery makers who have about 250 years of experience doing embroidery, and they work from everything from the royal family to Hermes and Louis Vuitton and so on. And they do a lot of embroidery by hand, because there are certain things that you can't do using computer controlled technology, especially the fine embroidery or the gold-based embroidery. But they also do use a lot of technology to help with the design process and also to produce more affordable pieces. So Hand and Lock are an interesting example of how technology allows them to broaden their market, but also change the way that people design the pieces. So next slide. So as well as the physical making, companies such as the Lian Embroidery Art Studio in China have extensive online presence. So it's not just having a website, but it's having social media, it's having online stores, it's connecting with other stores or large marketplaces in China where they can sell their wares. And so in this project, if we go to the next slide, we really investigated the value of these different kind of platforms and were interested in what is the difference between the use of technology in China and the UK. And one of the main differences that we noticed was the use of live streaming, real-time video in China, which was really quite extensive, and I'll show some examples later, compared to the UK. So this could be a potential way to learn from the Chinese use of technology and social media. So if we look at the next slide. So just to sum up, this project really was an investigation into how and what digital platforms are used for craft in the UK. As well as surveying these things, we came up with a number of recommendations about how technology could be used or how training could be better provided for digital skills. So for example, improving access and training to digital skills, improving access to the internet in general. Rural UK is very poorly supported, improving engagement with craft through technology, and improving protection of intellectual property, because that's a key concern when digital technologies are involved. So if we go to my final slide, the provocations that I'm bringing to this workshop, I should say that I'm actually a techno-optimist, right? So I think that there can be some positive impact from technology. I don't think all problems are going to be solved by technology, but I think there can be some impact, positive impact. And my approach is really to actively engage in this kind of cross-cultural co-design to explore the potential positive impact of technology. However, in this project, we did notice a few things that were kind of troubling. with technology, and this is the kind of provocations I'd like to bring to the conversation today. So when you start introducing digital platforms to craft, you're going to start pushing craft to become more like co-design, more like a design practice rather than a craft practice. So you're interacting more with customers, but then you're driven more by what the customers want rather than making the craft that you are inheriting. It's an interesting point that actually digital technologies will limit or determine which kind of crafts will survive to the next generation. So there are certain things that are easy to do with digital technologies in craft and some things that are difficult, and that will change what crafts survive into the future. Finally, there is an inherent risk of what I would call digital colonialism with digital technologies, which is the most major digital platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, Photoshop are inherently biased to the cultures that created them. So North American cultural worldview, basically. And that has an effect if you're trying to roll these out around the world. And finally, it's interesting to note that in some developing countries, craft makers actually have more access to online services and internet provision than they do in rural UK. And let's think about how does the government's support for internet and rural communities actually hinder progress in the UK in terms of craft. Okay, sorry, I have gone a minute over my time, so I will leave it back to Katja.
Thank you very much, Nick. So next up, we have Yemi Awosile, who's a designer living and working in London. And her work is informed by cultural insights expressed primarily through textiles and printed matter. And the broader scope of her practice bridges design and visual arts through social interventions. Recent projects of Yemi's include collaborations with Tent Rotterdam, Tate Gallery, Contemporary and C magazine, and the British Council. Her investigation into materials can be seen in the V&A Museum Textiles Handling Collection, and she has also recently been commissioned to produce 2 permanent public artworks in London, and she is also an associate lecturer at Goldsmiths. So over to Yemi, please.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me clearly? Great. Yeah, thank you for the invitation. It's really exciting to be here. So as mentioned, I'm a textile practitioner, and my work kind of spreads between visual arts and design, and it involves a lot of collaboration with people based outside of the UK. So mostly at the moment, the focus is on Africa, and I'm working with people based in Nigeria, Mozambique, and South Africa. Next slide, please. The recurring themes that always seem to come up in my work are ideas relating to innovation, tradition, design, manufacturing, and also there always tends to be like a environmental sustainability element as well, which is quite difficult to sorry, what was it? I just lost my train of thought. Sorry, the sustainability angle is not something that I intentionally look for. It's just something that's kind of embedded in all of my work. Next slide, please. Community is an integral part of the work as well. And I've also observed this in the work of practitioners around me, especially in the international projects. And this is a collection of images from one of my first cultural exchange projects, which was based in Pakistan, which was really insightful for me because it was where I really truly gained the understanding of how community is embedded in the fabric of craft. And that's mainly because of the visibility of the process. So even if you're not from a craft background or design background, people from the general public tend to have a really good understanding of what it means to engage in craft practice. And one of the most interesting things I observed was university design school in Karachi, they would often try to blur the lines between some of the boundaries that might normally stop that type of understanding between different groups. So for instance, they would encourage craft practitioners from a grassroots level. So let's say from rural communities, they would invite them into the academic surrounding, academic environment, into the classroom, into the lecture theatres to actually share their expertise with students and lecturers. So there was almost like a breaking down of hierarchies between craft knowledge, and I found that really exciting. So for me, visibility is really important in terms of understanding process. but then also create a connection between craft process or craft materiality and everyday milestones that emerge in our lives, like for instance through weddings, or if you look at the very top of the page, there's an image there of a man in a really colourful patchwork outfit, and he's a dancer. And so there is like a strong understanding or a strong dependence on using textiles to kind of really expand on his dance practice. And I saw that a lot in every aspect of the society, and I thought that was really interesting when I came back to the UK. Next slide, please. This is a collection of images of a project which took place in India in an area called Kirki, which is an urban village in Delhi. And there's a large African community there where you will find people from Nigeria, Somalia, Cameroon. It's a really eclectic mix of people. And this was a project where I was working with a group of young people who were trying to find a sense of belonging and a sense of identity. And we basically worked on a project where we used craft processes to try and kind of communicate these ideas about belonging or the idea of wanting to be heard. And craft, from my experience on this particular project, became more about the idea of communicating this idea or this yearning, this desire to feel heard or to feel like part of the tribe. And that's something that I've often, I see parallels with the way that people engage with digital technology at the moment. So in my mind, I feel like digital technology can be an excellent tool for communication, but it can also help break barriers and can, when married with craft, can really break hierarchies again. Next slide, please.
1 more minute.
Oh, 1 minute. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I've got so many slides. Okay, so basically I will maybe only talk about the next few slides, which is about my craft practice and how I really have gained a lot of inspiration from some of these experiences. So for me, it's mostly about looking for parallels between objects and people, or materials and people, and how that's often reflected within the craft tools or the craft materials that we produce. So here, if you look at the image on the, oh, sorry, if you look at the image on the, on my left-hand side, it's a handcrafted block used for applying colour to block printed fabrics. And on the next slide, you will see a collection of printed blocks which I made, which were rendered digitally and then fabricated using a CNC machine. And the idea about that was to try and raise questions about the desirability of handcrafted objects. So there's, with these particular block printed fabrics, there's a huge demand for the block printed fabrics, but actually the tools that are needed to create these fabrics, they don't really experience the same sort of demand in terms of people wanting to work on these labor intensive objects. And so there is an opportunity there for digital processes to kind of lengthen the longevity or the evolution of craft processes by maybe embedding maybe half and half in terms of what's made by hand and what can be made digitally.
Thank you. Sorry to cut you off here.
That's okay. That's okay.
We'll get a chance to come back to these points later on.
Okay.
Next up, we have the Decorating Dissidence Collective, for whom Suzanna Petot, a London-based curator, writer and co-organiser of Decorating Dissidence, alongside Jade French and Dr. Lottie Whalen, is speaking to us today. And Decorating Dissidence is an interdisciplinary project exploring the political, aesthetic and conceptual qualities of craft from modernism to the contemporary. And the project brings together art practitioners, makers, curators, activists and academics to break down disciplinary boundaries and find new ways to critically engage with craft histories through exhibitions, events, workshops, a podcast series and an online journal. So over to Suzanna.
Thank you. Sorry if the background is starting to make my face look a little bit weird. I'm definitely real. So Decorating Dissidence, as Katja said, is a project that was founded by soon-to-be Dr. Jade French and Dr. Lottie Whalen back in 2017. And the main focus of the project, which I joined in 2019, is really to broaden the perspectives and histories of craft from modernism to today. And we do that through a variety of paths, as Katja has mentioned: exhibitions, events, workshops, a podcast series that has recently launched, and our journal. And with the journal specifically, we look at to invite as many different voices to contribute to craft and to contribute to the documentation of this history as possible. So if you could go to the next slide. Really a big question for us with this project, as most of our the project lives online, is if you bring craft into the digital realm, does it then lose its value? Obviously, because craft and makers have such a strong relationship to using their hands and the physicality of doing the practice. If you then bring it on to the digital realm and you speak about it online, does it then lose its inherent value in being something that you work with your hands, your intimate connection with it? If you go to the next slide, please. So this is a slide of just a very brief example of what our journal looks like, which we have more than 13 issues on. And in a way, to that question, I would say that the obvious answer is that yes, of course, craft keeps its inherent value once it goes online. It's just the way in which you platform it and the way in which you bring that sense of community that is so inherent to craft practices also online. And we really try and do that with Decorating Dissidence, and specifically with the journal, where the more than 13 issues offer a really expansive view of craft and its history, from exhibition reviews to interviews with contemporary makers, spotlights on certain projects covering themes such as wearable art, witchcraft, queering craft, stitching the body and the environment. It's clear that you can define craft in many ways, and the fact that we offer this space for our community and collective to present their ideas and opinions in a respected manner really upholds what craft is about and the central ideas to which craft and the community, the global community which is formed around it, is based on. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And then last but certainly not least, we have Karen Patel, who is a research fellow in the Birmingham Center for Media and Cultural Research at Birmingham City University. And her current project is an AHRC funded innovation fellowship in collaboration with Crafts Council UK. And it's looking at inequalities in craft. And Karen is also the author of the book, The Politics of Expertise in Cultural Labor, Arts, Work and Inequalities. And she is the co-editor of Craft Entrepreneurship. So over to Karen.
Thank you, Katja. So my provocation talk today relates to the experiences of ethnically diverse women working in craft, particularly issues around visibility and invisibility on social media, and how useful social media is or could be for fostering sustainable communities of belonging in craft. Next slide, please. And a flashpoint for what I've been looking at with regards to the digital space occurred in January 2019, and some of you may have heard about this. And it was when a prominent white knitter and blogger based in the USA called Karen Templer wrote a blog post about the things that she wanted to do that year. And the post was called 2019, My Year of Colour, and you can see a screenshot of part of that post on the far left of this slide. And in that blog, Karen talked about how she wanted to go to India that year, and how when she was younger, being offered a trip to India was like, to quote Karen, being offered a seat on a flight to Mars. And that comment in particular provoked some backlash, which, as pointed out on this slide, comparing India to Mars is offensive and alienating. In response to this, a small group of ethnically diverse knitters from around the world used Instagram to highlight why Templa's blog post was offensive, and they attempted to educate others about it, as you can see on the other screenshots on this slide. And these efforts were met with some resistance and backlash from some white makers, mostly white makers, who jumped to Karen's defence. And in some cases, this led to racist abuse, which were directed at these knitters. And obviously, this doesn't just happen in craft. It's quite symptomatic of online discourse, especially at the moment. Next slide, please. So the reaction to the Karen Templer blog post, which was the knitters' attempts to educate others about racism, and the response they received, demonstrates how volatile social media can be and how it can be unsafe for women and women of colour. And these issues were brought to the fore in craft when one of the knitters started collecting anonymous experiences of racism from other knitters of colour from around the world. And there are examples here on this slide. So they talked about not wanting to put their face out there, mainly because they didn't want people to think of their craft negatively and not want to buy it. They felt that people would judge their craft based on the colour of their skin. And similar things have come out in the interviews from my project as well. Others talked about racism they experienced in knitting groups and racist comments received online. And the knitter who collected all of these responses then curated them and posted them as Instagram stories. And however, months later, she removed absolutely everything relating to racism, relating to any of these issues, almost as if she never carried out the work. All of her work and the crucial role that she played in raising awareness of racism in knitting was erased. Her Instagram profile became strictly business. And this is possibly because she wants her craft to be judged on its own merits and not have that blurring between the personal and the professional. But I suppose if you are a maker of colour and you get drawn into these debates, is that ever possible? What I've talked about here highlights the complexities of the online space and the potential reasons why whiteness is so visible in craft, and why it is incredibly difficult in craft for these online spaces to be safe for women of colour. For communities of belonging to be created online using digital spaces, I think they need to be much safer than they currently are. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Could I ask all the speakers now to please turn on their video, perhaps? So we're gonna have a bit of a Q&A, and also for the attendees, you know, don't forget to do your doodling as we're going along with the conversation. We'd love to see at the end what you've come up with. Well, thank you, everyone. Those were fantastic provocations, and we could talk about this for hours, I'm sure. But I think one strand that's come through to varying degrees in all of your talks is the idea of co-design, or as Nick specifically used the term, but also I think co-design in terms of making something together, but also developing your practice in response to how other people react to it. So maybe to start off with Nick, could you perhaps say a few more words on whether you've experienced or whether you noticed any difference to how these processes of co-design happen in the UK and in China, or is it a very similar development?
I think the similarities in terms of in both countries, there's an increasing amount of connection between let's say the consumer and the maker. The difference is, to my mind, is the speed, really. So in the UK, maybe people would have an email conversation, or they would reply to some tweet, or they'd have an Instagram post and somebody would say, hey, I love that, can you make that in blue or something like this. Whereas typically in China, it would be much more direct messaging or live video chat and something like this. So the interesting thing about that is that with the Chinese craft makers that we worked with, they were much more present in this process, if that makes sense. So they were much more on the screen, they were much more talking and conversational, whereas in the UK it was a little bit slower, a bit more transactional, a bit more like, oh, you know, one message comes and then you send a message back later type thing. So what we found when we interviewed craft makers in both countries was, yeah, there was an increasing amount of responsiveness to people, to consumers by makers, but the way that it worked was different.
Okay, thank you very much. And just a reminder also to the audience to please, you know, post any questions in the Q&A. You don't have to wait till the very end. You can start doing this right away. Yemi, you obviously in your practice, you've worked with people from different African countries, but also in Pakistan, as you mentioned. Kind of building on what Nick just said and how the difference between the UK and China, is that anything that you've come across in your practice, or do you notice differences in terms of speed, but also in terms of what people are allowed to access in the digital realm, perhaps?
I think one of the things that really stood out to me was how important social media, or how it's integrated into a lot of the professional practice. So things that might be seen as more informal here are actually an integral part of communication, even when you're speaking to someone who may seem to be like in a very high position, or if you have like a really super important meeting, some of the communication means, to me, it doesn't even seem to, the idea of what's informal or what's formal is a bit blurred. And I find that really interesting and also a lot quicker. And I feel that since we've had the pandemic globally, that we've kind of taken that on now here and across the globe. So for me, that was quite an innovation to experience before experiencing it here in say the UK.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, the pandemic has probably had a significant impact on how crafters engage with the digital now, especially since a lot of the shows have been cancelled. And speaking of shows then, so Karen, I was wondering with regards to your topic, how, so you're clearly, obviously, the example you discussed, it ends with, you know, the maker kind of pulling all these things, taking it off the digital, right? Because the harassment to abuse was just too much. But do you also know of examples in which the digital has provided a kind of a space of community, especially for makers of color, to come together, to share their experiences in a safe environment? And I'm also thinking about it in the context that any kind of, you know, crafts and hobbies show, any like of the commercial kind of shows that people can go to are very white spaces, right? So people of color would stand out. So yeah, do you know of anything like that you've come across within these practices?
Yeah, so the person who took all of the Instagram stories down, she actually started an offline support group. So I think she used that work, which really highlighted the issues that knitters face in those spaces. And I think she just took that offline, and she started a support group, and it had a Facebook page. And I'm not sure if it's still, I think it's still going. So that was an example of an online activity which turned into an offline support group specific to Australia, this was. So I think what she did was really incredibly important for highlighting the issues and also providing that safe and supportive space, because you could submit your experiences anonymously and you could look at them and think, oh, that doesn't just happen to me, then it happens to other people. So there were plenty of other examples of that happening. And it's also come up in the interviews as well. So I've interviewed British makers, and quite a few of them who use social media regularly often talked about how useful it is to reach out to other makers of colour, especially if they're in rural settings and they go to these shows which are mostly white and so on. So it's enabled them to connect with others online, especially on Instagram. So it's definitely had its uses in that respect.
Okay, thank you. Speaking of social media and connecting people, we've had a question from the audience that speaks to questions of age and people's abilities to engage with the digital and social media platforms. And so Emily Burns is asking whether you think this might affect the types of crafts that will be popular and what might be lost over time. And I think Yemi would like to come in on that. Do you want to go?
Oh, hello. Yeah, no, I had some experience actually working in a care home, and it was working with people mostly suffering with dementia. And the intention was it was part of a residency where I would spend time with them, facilitating craft activities. But what I really found from that experience was that like the presence of craft wasn't necessarily about just like working for a process. It was more about finding a space where people could feel comfortable to connect. And I found that like this whole body of work which was created based on this experience, I named it Digital Native, because at the time I was thinking about the idea of what it's like to be a person who's only ever lived in a world where we're surrounded by so much technology, but at the same time live alongside people who lived when there wasn't so much of this kind of like bombardment of technology. And it was really fascinating because there was like a really, what I found to be like a really magical exchange where their level of craft knowledge was so high that they became the facilitator and I was learning from them. And there were instances where I would use like my phone to try to communicate an idea about craft, but the technology was more about the communication aspect rather than trying to take on like a process, like a digital process. And there was a lot of excitement about the tools, like the phone, how the phone works, and being able to look at photographs. And I showed them my work on the phone, and they were not even interested in my work at all. They were just interested in the phone. And it was just really interesting to see how those two worlds kind of clash and come together. So I think that in my opinion, maybe it shouldn't necessarily be about trying to take a group of people who are not naturally inclined to work in that way, but maybe there are other ways that the technology can benefit them. I don't know if that makes sense. So it's not necessarily about just learning a digital process, but it might just be about embracing digital technology in a way which is more about facilitating ideas.
Thank you very much. Great question and great answer. Susanna, I think so Decorating Dissidence and the way it works, as in, you know, having kind of the journal as a digital unit, but also, you know, putting up conferences, workshops, exhibitions. I think it very much, you know, tries to cover multiple areas, but also I think is with the goal to also archive, as you said, what is going on. And could you maybe perhaps speak to that also in relation to speed, which Nick mentioned earlier, in terms of, you know, how does craft practice change as it engages with the digital, whereas then the kind of journal and the writings are already a process of reflection to some extent on these changing practices and the day-to-day operation of craft in a contemporary, but also in a historical perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think particularly in the sense of speed and archiving with the journal, I think in the past year, especially, we've seen a lot more people reflecting on their practices due to the pandemic, obviously, and how they have been taking up more digital forms and how that's entered into their practice than they would have before. And that is from young makers to older makers. It crosses basically all the generations, it seems to us. And with the sense of what's necessarily changing would be more of how open people are about talking about their processes and about trying to put together a community. I think what's great with Decorating Dissidence is that we've been able to highlight that there's sometimes this idea that craft is very isolating and that you make it yourself, you're in your home. But with the way that the journal has allowed people to speak more about their practices or other makers that they're interested in. A lot of the interviews happen between makers, not just us asking, but there's a sense of community within that, and that builds its own value and archive, as well as with our podcast, where we try and have more conversations about what contemporary makers are looking back to and how maybe craft history and modernism in general has influence what they're doing now. And that's, especially with young makers, it's really important for them to see that there are connections to what they're doing that they might not have recognized before, that have these threads that go back to the 20s and the 30s. And that's something that, especially with our project Take Dada Seriously, which I'll talk about later, really came out and then was highlighted even more when we invited young people to take part in these workshops.
Okay, thank you. So Alpha Monks has asked a question in the Q&A section about what do we make of the recent space of popular television programs centered on craft practices and practices of making more generally, which are often framed as Great British. And so she's wondering where this recent appetite for making by hand has come from, but obviously, you know, it is being featured in the digital realm. So I think at first pose this to Nick, who earlier you mentioned how you think the digital will mean that some craft practices are more likely to continue gaining prominence or to continue being sustained, whereas others might not. And whether you notice any particular practices being affected by this in the UK, and whether there's any kind of sense of national identity maybe, or cultural heritage connected to these practices that come through as they get sustained and or taken into the digital realm.
Yeah, okay, so actually think about that, the issue of which kind of crafts may survive in this digital world. One of the important sort of underlying assumptions that people have is that digital technology will be able to support all sorts of crafts, but there are many kinds of crafts where actually digital technology is useless at supporting that kind of craft. So, for example, when we were in China, there was a lot of work with large bamboo structures or large porcelain objects, which you can't really capture that in a video. You can't really 3D print that because it's too big, or you can't really explain the structure of how you do the burning of the bamboo to make it a certain softness to be able to manipulate it. This kind of stuff really didn't come across, wasn't really supported by the digital technologies that were available. So my concern there was really about, yeah, okay, we've got these things like TV shows that talk about these different things, but that's fun stuff like Great British Bake Off or Great British Sewing Bee or whatever, things that are easy to show on TV. But what about the things that are difficult to show on TV? What about, like I said, the kind of embroidery that Hand and Lock did, which was using gold thread, which is super difficult to do. You can't use a machine to do it. How are you going to show that on TV? It takes a long time to do. So as a TV program, it'd be pretty boring to watch. So these kind of things, I think, will be a challenge because there's a risk that the digital technologies and the focus on and the reliance on digital technology will mean that these things become more and more niche and more essentially like a kind of specialist high art form that only a few people can make it. And as people, you know, craft is often a handed down generational thing. As more of the old masters, you know, die off, how are these traditions going to get carried on through the digital era? And that would be my concern. And it touched a little bit on what Yemi was saying earlier as well in terms of the different age groups and their connections. But my concern is really digital technologies are very limiting, actually. They have specific constraints. They can do certain things really well, like Photoshop, super duper, but other things just no good at all. And we're going to lose those things that are relying on the things that digital technology can't do. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answered all the question, but it sort of addressed many of the things in there, I think.
Yes, thank you. That's a great answer. So Karen, then kind of staying a bit with this point about, you know, Great Britishness and like national identity, and which crafts would be considered typically British or typically, I mean, you know, there's also like there's also very gendered elements to crafts. So your example was about knitting, and that, you know, it's heavily gendered. It's also heavily raced, as in like this idea of the white genteel woman kind of performing the knitting. So could you maybe speak to how in your research craft practitioners also engage with these questions of who craft is for, and how they are maybe through their material but also through their digital practices are kind of reframing our ideas about who craft is for and why?
Yeah, so it's come up a lot in the interviews, particularly with the makers, about who craft is for. And one of the women I spoke to actually talked about British craft and the whiteness of British craft. So she is based in London, and she's of South Asian heritage, and she was talking about how I constantly get told or asked, why don't I make more craft that's more related to my culture? And then when I do that, I'm told, well, that's not going to sell. That's not for this market. And she said, she talked about how she felt like she was in a lose-lose situation. And she said the problem with craft nowadays, it is this very white British notion of craft, which you see in this sort of the Great British Bake Off and so on. And I just don't fit into that. So I've just got to try and just carry on with what I'm doing and try and sort of hope that people who understand where it comes from, my craft, and can relate to it, can buy it. And I think a lot of it relates to the audience for contemporary craft in this country. The people who are able to afford this high-end craft tend to be white, middle class, upper middle class people with a lot of disposable income, and that in turn affects the popular aesthetics of the craft market and the types of craft which are deemed valuable and worthy of selling and promoting and putting to the forefront in these craft spaces and markets. And that was a real point of tension for many of my interviewees, who just felt that their work didn't fit in the UK craft marketplace. And these British craft shows, they sort of help to reproduce and promote this image. And I think in terms of that, the academic Susan Luckman, her 2015 book, Craft and the Creative Economy, she talks about how this rise in the popularity of craft is related to a nostalgia and a sort of rejection of mass production, and it's all sort of related to that idea of, you know, the keep calm, carry on nostalgia for the handmade, which has I think during the pandemic is probably it's accelerated a little bit. But then again, I think when Black Lives Matter had a resurgence last year, that really made a lot of different sections of the craft sector really look at itself and the types of aesthetics it's promoting. So hopefully that some change is happening, albeit quite slowly.
Thank you. And then we've got a question from Lauren in the Q&A that I think also then kind of speaks to what you were just saying, Karen, because she's asking whether you see any potential in the development of international markets for craft products from the global south through the development of e-commerce platforms acting as intermediaries to promote products from a particular region and to target international audiences. So basically, can the digital then kind of be a way for people to branch out into new markets that are actually more open to the types of crafts that they are producing as opposed to kind of local British markets? Do you have any take on that, Karen?
Yes, I think it definitely has potential, the digital, for that branching out. And I think for some people that I've interviewed, they've found it much easier to sell their work online because they can promote it internationally and reach those audiences. So I think it definitely has potential.
Great, thank you. And Yemi, I was just wondering, coming back to the original point about, you know, different, like this idea of a craft being particular to like a national tradition. Could you speak about your experiences in doing these kind of cultural exchange craft practices that you've touched on in your provocation, and to maybe speak a bit to craft as a marker of identity, and craft practice or shared craft practice as about passing on knowledge and identity and heritage, really?
I think for me, one of the amazing things about craft is that, you know, you can have people on the complete opposite sides of the world. Maybe they've never come into physical contact, and yet through a craft process or through an understanding of a raw material, you know, how to nurture that material, how to process it, how to turn it into something that can be of use, how to, you know, make use of your resources around you. These two groups or these two communities are able to maybe see some sort of connection or have a really strong understanding of one another because of this sensibility to, you know, working by hand or working with your surrounding environment. And I found that that's really something that has really kind of stayed with me, you know, whilst I've, you know, collaborated or observed how other people have worked, from, you know, definitely looking at some of the craft processes that you might find in India. There's a lot that are mirrored in African traditional techniques also, and in other parts of the world. And I just feel like there's just something really exciting and innovative about how creativity can be harnessed in a way to produce these kind of like technically advanced materials, which sometimes are not really getting full credit. Sometimes I feel like craft can be looked down upon as being not sophisticated, or being a bit sometimes even primitive in some ways, which is a real shame, because for me it's very it's like a unique type of intelligence, you know, being able to work with your hands and being able to communicate without words and to connect with other people through the way that they use your materials, or through the way that they're able to kind of recreate the work that you're making through craft.
Great, thank you. So Susanna, I would like to come to your case study that you've brought with us about Dada, and thinking about how this has become a way also to connect people from different historical contexts with each other. So I'm gonna share my screen again, and then I will take us. And I think, Susanna, you will also have to share your screen. Yes. So let's tell us about Take Dada Seriously, please.
Sure, thank you. So Take Data Seriously, It's Worth It, ? Was a digital residency that we had at Guest Projects in Hackney from June to July 2020. And I should note that we were awarded this residency in the late fall of 2019 and had been developing it to be in person. And so always to be in June 2020. And so we had to very quickly adapt our original idea for this project to become digital and fully online once the pandemic started. And of course, everything was put into lockdown. But for the online residency, the question really itself was, are these modernist legacies still relevant? And are they worth our attention, our time, and our research today, specifically in regards to Dada and the legacies to craft? The simple answer is, of course, yes, they are. But why was really the meaty part of the project. And not only did we want to celebrate aspects of Dada and how the movement has contributed greatly to the history of art and design, particularly globally, but particularly in the West, in the UK, but also wanted to challenge its legacy and how what we know about Dada is very, very narrow. And we wanted to wind it up to present and include artists and makers who are usually pushed to the margins of these narratives, female, queer, disabled, and artists of color particularly. So 100 years after the Dada Fair in 1920 that shocked Berlin, what had remained? And that was really what we were trying to draw out from this project. If you could go to the next slide. This should be a video that shows you the website, but don't worry, I'll put it in the chat afterwards. So we, the next question from, how are we starting this this project was how were we going to take this residency that was meant to be in person and involve 4 artists who you see named on the screen. So Jade Montserrat, Sarah Kelly, Bettina Fung, and Hannah Skinner. We were going to commission work. They were going to show it in space for a certain amount of time. People were going to come. There was going to be a huge public engagement aspect. And there were going to be all these great conversations. How do we put that online? So we then created a fully online exhibition platform to explore this legacy and to really have an interactive experience where it wasn't just having the works on a page that you scroll through, but having somewhere where the visitors could come and have those playful, humorous elements of Dada that a lot of people know about also into the fabric of the digital form. And the other side of our residency was, of course, still keeping that public engagement aspect alive. So if you could go to the next slide, we divided our project into 3 streams. So the artists themselves, salons, which we were basically public events, and they were going to be able to host a number of different individuals to give their perspectives and their experience from many different backgrounds on the different aspects of Dada that we wanted to draw out. So whether this was poetry, whether it was working with found objects, whether it was looking particularly at queer histories within Dada, or trying to investigate the very, very sticky and problematic use of indigenous artifacts that a lot of Dada artists from the 20s and 30s pretty much appropriated and never gave full credit to where they were getting their ideas and their images from. We did that through these events, and then also resources where we opened it up and had a open call for people to contribute different essays, interviews, practices for, again, in a similar way to our journal, to have more people contribute to this idea. So it wasn't just our voices, but many voices from different backgrounds contributing onto the legacy and challenging Dada. And so we had 3 salons and 4 workshops, which were particularly for young people. If you go to the next slide. So our first salon was Digital Dada, in which we invited students from the media and technology aspect part of Queen Mary, which Nick very much knows, to come and present their work along with Bettina Fung, one of our artists. about what elements of Dada have been brought into the digital and how their practices speak to those different aspects of Dada, and if basically Dada would live to the digital element, what it would look like. So this performance here by Bettina, which was called Everything Online is Dead, was a 28-minute digital performance on Google Docs in which she presented a couple of questions at the beginning of the doc, which I will share my screen to show you very quickly what it looks like. So it's 28 minutes, and there you go, you should see it now. As you see, people then started live entering into this document, in which she wanted to draw out how you could still create a performance online. And to do that, how do you, particularly how her practice is participatory, how could you do that online? And using the Google Docs, people anonymously were able to enter in different drawings, different phrases, poetry. You could interrupt different people, you could delete things, you could highlight things. It was meant to be an incredibly free space where people could just freely express, with her interacting and contributing as well, but really meant to be, this was in the spirit of Dada and their collaborative making. And so at the end, she then deletes the whole thing, really showing also that how quickly things online can disappear.
That's fascinating, Susanna, and sorry to interrupt you. I'm conscious of time, but I think what you just showed us speaks in a really great way to this question of process and the process of making, and how we can use process or use the digital to potentially choreograph process and how something is made. And Nick, I think some of the examples of TikTok videos from China that you've brought for us today, I think very much in very interesting ways also show this question of process. And my PowerPoint slide seems to have gone missing. And let me just get them up. Do you just want to say a few words about the use of TikTok before I play the video, Nick?
Sure, yeah. So there are 4 example videos here, very short TikTok videos. And these were part of the project. When we looked at it a couple of years ago, there was a lot of people using TikTok in China and hardly any in the UK using it for craft anyway. Obviously, that's changed now more in the pandemic. But what's interesting about these TikTok videos that we got recently is, first one you'll see, so if we go back a couple of slides, first one is really sort of telling a story about craft heritage. So it's trying to be more educational. And so you'll see some information about how the Huayo craft women show this process. So in the slide before, yeah, this one. And then, and this is mainly used for decoration of dresses. And then after this video, you'll see a very short extract of a live TikTok feed, which just happens all the time. So let's go through the first one.
So I'm afraid we won't have time to go through all.
Oh, okay, all right. So this.
I'm going to shamelessly ask.
Crazy music.
I'm going to shamelessly ask us to watch this one because I think this one is my favorite so far.
Okay.
So I do just want to say a few words about this one because I think it's also quite interestingly bridges marketing with showing process and actually trying to sell stuff, doesn't it?
Yeah. Okay. So this one is telling the story of a craft making studio, and they're talking about how these people inherited the skills of this particular kind of embroidery. So some young sisters born in the 1990s opened an embroidery shop in Hunan province in China, and then they're trying to show about both the tradition, but how they go about using this tradition to make new things for sale, for craft. So it's a promotional TikTok. Yeah, so it's great because it shows, it sort of connects the really traditional embroidery style with contemporary and the fun kind of products that people might be wanting to buy these days.
Thank you. And I think another interesting aspect, and we've touched on this in various ways throughout this conversation today, is the relationship between, you know, people's identity as a crafter and the particular craft they're making, but also how they're then using the digital in a way to fashion this identity for themselves, but also as a maker and as somebody who sells objects. And I think the craft studies, the examples that Karen brought with her here today, sorry, I can't, the music just keeps coming up.
Crazy music.
Yes. I think they really, in a really nice way, also kind of pick up on this and talk about how these makers use the digital not only as a way to kind of showcase their work, but also as a way to develop as workers, as crafters, as craft makers themselves, and to network with other crafters. So this is an interview with jewelry designer Tashita David, and I'm just going to fast forward a bit, and where we can listen to Tashita talk about her experiences with social media for her own craft business and her identity as a maker. And then maybe Karen, perhaps after we've watched the video, you want to say a few words about this?
I think those, yes, definitely in the last 10 years, social media seems to have become a very important part of the crafts industry, if you would say. A lot of designers are on it. I quite enjoy following people, other artists, and also other organizations like Craftspace, which is a local Birmingham company, and just finding different local opportunities and national opportunities for exhibitions, seeing what other people are doing. It's quite exciting, and seeing new work being done by other people. Quite often I find even seeing processes, how people are doing different things, just details. It's quite nice into seeing a maker's inside space as well through social media.
Karen, do you want to say a few words maybe in response to this?
Yeah, so these interviews were part of a project I did previously about specifically more about social media and how social media could potentially improve the diversity of craft. And these interviews were for the Crafts Council website, and they shared their experiences of social media and their top tips for using social media. And a key theme was the importance of just seeing the processes and sharing your own process and putting your own expertise across on social media was a really important part of that for the makers that I interviewed. And just feeling like you can connect with others and learn from others online really came through in Tashita's and in Arati's. I don't know if we'll have time to see hers, but yeah, they both talked about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm afraid we don't have time to see Arati's, but I believe Justine will put the link to the videos into the chat, so anyone can go off after the conversation and watch them. And if you look at Karen's website and see, we'll find much more interviews. So I definitely encourage everyone to do that, and also keep putting your questions in the chat. We might not have a chance to get to all of them, but I will try. But I think, so also kind of mindful of time, and as we are getting to the end of our time for today, I think what is really interesting about the whole conversation we've had so far, and the many things we've touched on, but particularly also thinking about process and documenting process, is how it seems to me that a lot of what we've been talking about also comes back to storytelling and telling a story about yourself, about what you make, as much as about the craft in itself, you know, where it comes from, what you're doing with it, where is it going. And I think, you know, given that this event is a week of conversations at Queen Mary, I think this is a very powerful note to potentially also kind of conclude our discussion and think about how craft, as in, you know, in the digital realm, but also beyond, is being used by different people in different ways to tell stories about themselves and about their interactions with others. And so I think the example, the case study that Yemi brought today really kind of touches on this aspect of storytelling. And Yemi, you might want to say a few words to introduce it or not. Let me know if you just want me to play it or not. But and we might not have a chance to watch all of it, but I think it will give us a very interesting idea of the storytelling aspect of craft and the way this works through digital technologies as well.
Well, this is a project called Hyperculture, and it's an ongoing project, a collaboration between myself and a designer based in Lagos, Nigeria. And we were thinking about indigenous technology and indigenous craft, and how it has how it's intrinsically and very similar to some of the principles that exist within circular design. Because we're really interested in the idea of how you can lengthen the lifespan of like textile objects that are created. So we created a collection of open source motifs that people can use, which are all about storytelling. And I've got some examples here of how I've taken some of the motifs and kind of translated them into kind of digital embroidery and patterns, which represents an idea or a concept. And you can go to the Hyperculture website, it's hyperculture.site, to find out more. And just to kind of try and capture the process, we created this short video. It's about 3 minutes long, and so yeah, just have a look and maybe go to the website to just follow us as we progress on this idea of how we can explore extending the life cycle of textile garments.
I'll play a little bit of the video because I think it also the illustrations speak very nicely to this idea of doodling. And
yes, also, exactly. Yeah, I was thinking about the doodling for this. This
and I think and as we watch it, as we all watch it, we might also want to think then how illustration is another form of or digital illustration is another form of capturing craft processes beyond, you know, like the obvious kind of video recording we could do.
A life of objects is a life mapped on cloth. As it transitions from one day to the next, through partnerships and anniversaries to achievements and loss, this is the story of a person journeying through life. It's a life enshrined on cloth and commemorated through stitch, capturing pivotal moments through a lexicon of motifs. I received my first year garment just as I was about to start my first year at university. It was a gift from my father, and it was the moment that I added my first motifs to cloth.
Right, I'll stop there. But as Yemi said, you go to the website, have a look at it afterwards. It's a great video, it's a great way of telling stories of objects, but also the story of processes of making. So we've got about 5 minutes left. It's crazy how quickly the time passed. I believe we could probably talk for at least another hour on this topic. So if you have any more questions, please put them in the chat. I've got a question by Pauline de Sousa here, who asks about what your thoughts are on craft people working with software companies to produce co-design technologies for craft. So I think this is quite an interesting question also, because it touches a bit more on the commercial side of things, and in ways that the digital allows craft makers to enter into industries in new ways, perhaps. So the question isn't directed at anyone specifically, but Nick, perhaps you want to have first go with it, and then everyone else feel free to jump in and to also just turn on your videos for this last bit of the conversation.
Okay. I think the first thing I would say is that I actually think that writing software and programming is a craft itself, by the way. It's a craft of making things by hand, essentially. Anyway, in terms of co-designing software products for craft, I think this would be, I think it's an interesting direction. And I think what would be challenging would be the size or scale of the market for that piece of software that you create. So a lot of I'm thinking about some of the, smaller craft, smaller kinds of crafts that would be out there. Would it be feasible to even create a piece of software for that craft? Because maybe the number of people that do it is just a handful. Is it even a feasible thing to do, would be my question. Maybe that's where the open source community comes in to that. Yeah.
Anyone else want to jump in on that? Say anything else? No? Okay, so speaking then, kind of, because this ties on to this idea of how we make things and kind of the process and using the digital as well as the material. Nick, I know you've had a question for Yemi about printing blocks. So do you maybe want to pose it to Yemi?
So I did have a question. So I loved the example of the printing blocks that you showed at the very beginning, Yemi, with where you use the CNC machine to create the blocks out of wood. And one of the things that we found interesting looking at, for example, 3D printing for craft in the UK and China was, in the UK, craft makers can get access to 3D printing in like making spaces or all sorts of, craft centers and so on. Whereas in China, it's really difficult for craft makers to get access to this kind of technology, because it's basically in a university, and only if you are a university professor or a university student can you access that stuff. So I was interested in your example of whether exploring those forms of using CNC machines or 3D printing machines, is that inclusive in the areas that you were working, or is it sort of exclusionary? Does it make it a sort of elitist activity?
I think it is an elitist activity at the moment. When I was in India, I came across quite a few make spaces, but I think with the people that I've been working with in Southern Africa and also in Nigeria, it's more of an elitist. Not everyone has access to those sorts of things. So a lot of the work actually has come through collaboration. So where I've seen examples of the work, it's maybe because of like social media, it's much easier for people to connect and then to work together and then in a way swap resources. Or like, for instance, I find it really difficult to get access to like beautifully dyed indigo fabrics. I can't from here, but I can work with people who do, and I often do. We swap our resources and work together and make sure that we credit each other, and also kind of educate the people around us about the collaboration and the different perspectives that we're bringing to the project. So yeah, no, I think definitely agree with you on that one.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, great. So we've got another question from Pauline about networks for makers of color, particularly crafters of color. And I was just wondering, Karen, perhaps you could also just put the names of some, because I know they are out there in the chat, as the audience might be interested in following this up later.
Yeah, just replied to the question.
Oh, I just saw. Okay, fantastic, great. Okay, great. So, to the audience, if you have any final question, you've got like 1 more minute to put them in the chat, because I'm afraid our time has come to the end. Also keep in mind that we would love to see your doodles, so please take a picture, upload it to Instagram or Twitter. Justine will be kind enough, I'm sure, to put the Twitter and Instagram handle in the chat box, so you can all look it up again. But I think, as a word of conclusion, if I may, to our discussion, I think what's been really great that's come out of from all the contributions and from the great questions we've had from the audience is that while we maybe, you know, commonly we'd like to think of like a divide between craft and the digital, and, you know, we said there are all kinds of challenges and it can have an adverse effect for some people and for some crafts, but it also can have a highly positive on others. But I think what it really shows is that there isn't a division, or like a complete abstract division, at least between these spheres, but it is already so interconnected in the way that it is feeding from each other in various ways, and that in the way it brings people together as communities within locally, but also so globally, on so many kind of different levels and in so many different ways that you know, are quite unexpected at times, but very powerful, and are forging connections that I think, you know, people will be able to benefit from in various ways for a very long time. Any speakers maybe want to share some final thoughts on this, or anything else? Yes, Nick, please.
Yeah, so I just had a really quick thing I wanted to say about, you were talking about the use of social media to tell stories about craft and how important that was for makers. And one of the things that came up in our research was also to not just tell stories, but to explain the value and the heritage of the craft. So like, why does it take so long to make this thing? What is the cultural or, you know, traditional value of this thing? Why are you making these things? To me, that was a super important part of connecting with digital, was to convey that to the next generation, to convey it to a wider audience what the value of this craft is.
Yeah, excellent, great point. And I think this also speaks to what Suzanna and the Decorating Dissidents are doing, but value on a very kind of like high art and low art craft kind of level, deconstructing these binaries between the two by taking something like Dada, which would be, you know, considered like high pro art, into the digital realm, and kind of also reconfiguring how we think of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And also that Dada used craft as well, and that a lot of the major modernist movements that we think of, there are craft elements along with many of those movements. There doesn't need to be this divide between high art and low art or craft, in that they usually coexist. And also just speaking to what Nick was saying about how it's so important for social media to also show the stories and the process, that things take a long time, and also where they come from, was really key to keeping craft accessible. And I think that something that makes craft unique from, say, other forms of high or fine art is that it is accessible, and it needs to be accessible. And I think social media and digital platforms are really what's key, and why a lot of craft makers use it, is to be able to keep that accessibility open.
Thank you. Any other panels? Yemi, Karen, any final thoughts you want to share? Okay, well then, thank you so much, everyone. I think this was really great. Thank you very much to the audience for participating, for posing questions. Thanks again for Queen Mary for hosting us today, for making this conversation possible. And again, as I said, please share your doodles to Instagram and to Twitter. We'd love to see what you've come up with, and to maybe also continue conversations beyond this session, and to just talk more about craft, the digital, and community. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good rest of the day. Bye.